The room is small and the light is low. Outside the walls of Hamadan, in the year 1037, a military campaign is winding down. Soldiers move through the evening air. Horses are watered. Fires are lit against the cooling dark of a Persian night. And inside a room that was never meant to be a sick room, the finest physician in the world is lying on a simple bed, examining himself with the same quiet precision he brought to every patient who ever lay before him. He has written his own diagnosis. He has prescribed his own treatment. And he knows, with the particular certainty that only a physician of his skill can possess, that neither the diagnosis nor the treatment will save him this time. His name is Ibn Sina. The Latin world will call him Avicenna. And the book he finished writing, the book already sitting in copies across the libraries of 2 civilizations, will be used to teach medicine to students in Europe for centuries after this night. He is 57 years old. He has never stopped asking the one question that drove everything he did. What is it? Exactly. To exist. To exist. Tonight, let that question settle over you. Let the noise of your world fall away. We are going back 1,000 years, to a place where the greatest mind of the medieval world was born, lived, and died, and where the questions he asked still have not been fully answered. This is the complete life of Avicenna. Chapter 1. The world he was born into. To understand Avicenna, you have to first understand the world that made him possible. Genius does not appear in a vacuum. It appears at intersections. And the intersection of time and place into which Ibn Sina was born, in 980, in the city of Bukhara, was one of the most extraordinary in human history. Bukhara today is a quiet city in modern Uzbekistan, a place of old mosques and dusty bazaars that travellers visit to feel the weight of a past that no longer quite exists in the form it had. But in 980, Bukhara was one of the most alive cities on earth. It was the capital of the Samanid dynasty, a Persian ruling house that had turned their court into a magnet for scholars, poets, mathematicians, and physicians from across the Islamic world. The streets were full of people moving between languages, Persian, Arabic, the remnants of older tongues that had survived the conquests of earlier centuries. The markets traded not just in silk and spice, but in ideas. This was the eastern edge of what historians, drawing on the work of scholars like Dimitri Gutas of Yale University, have called the Islamic Golden Age. The phrase covers roughly 5 centuries, from the 800s to the 1300s, during which the Islamic world produced advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and engineering that would not be matched in Europe for generations. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established under the Abbasid Caliph al-Ma'mun in the early 9th century, had already spent decades translating the great works of Greek antiquity into Arabic. Let that settle for a moment. Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, Euclid, works that the Latin West had lost, or never had, were being read, debated, corrected, and extended in Baghdad, in Bukhara, in cities along the Silk Road whose names the European maps of the time did not even contain. The Abbasid Caliphate itself, centered in Baghdad, was by 980 already weakening. The political unity of the early Islamic world had fractured into competing dynasties and rival courts. But here is the thing that the history of ideas teaches us again and again, and that Avicenna's life demonstrates with particular clarity. Political fragmentation does not always kill intellectual culture. Sometimes it accelerates it, when a single central power no longer controls all the patronage. Ambitious rulers in smaller courts compete for prestige by sponsoring scholars. They build libraries, they invite philosophers, they fund translations. The fracturing of the Abbasid Empire into competing dynasties created exactly this kind of competitive intellectual patronage, and Bukhara under the Samanids was one of its finest expressions. Into this world, in a village called Afshana, just outside Bukhara, a boy was born to Abdullah ibn Sina, a government administrator, and his wife Sitara. The family was educated and comfortable, connected to the administrative machinery of the Samanid court. They were Ismaili Muslims, followers of a Shia branch of Islam that placed particular emphasis on the inner, rational interpretation of religious texts. This is not a small detail. The Ismaili tradition had a long and specific relationship with Greek philosophy, particularly with Neoplatonism, and the household Ibn Sina grew up in was one where philosophical questions about the nature of existence and the relationship between reason and revelation were not abstract. They were dinner-table conversations. They were the air he breathed from the time he could form sentences. His father moved the family to Bukhara when Ibn Sina was still very young, and it was in Bukhara that his education began. Tutors were arranged, subjects were introduced, and almost immediately the people responsible for teaching the boy began to notice something they did not have a clear category for. He was not simply fast. He was not simply diligent, though he was both of those things in ways that would have distinguished any student. What set him apart was something more difficult to name. He seemed to encounter new material and absorb it, not as a student absorbs a lesson, piece by piece, with repetition and effort, but as someone who recognized something they had been waiting to find. His first teachers described working through a topic with him and finding, by the end of the session, that the student was raising questions about the subject that the teacher had not considered, not to show off, not to challenge, simply because the questions were there, and to him it was obvious they needed to be asked. The city around him was full of people who had devoted their lives to knowledge, merchants who carried scientific texts along with their goods, judges who were also astronomers, physicians who were also poets. The Islamic scholarly tradition of this period did not draw the sharp lines between disciplines that the modern world takes for granted. A man who studied medicine was expected to understand the philosophical foundations of medicine, which meant understanding Aristotle, which meant engaging with logic and metaphysics, which meant confronting questions about the nature of existence itself. The divisions we impose now, between science and philosophy, between reason and faith, between the empirical and the speculative, were not the divisions of Bukhara in 980. This mattered enormously for what Ibn Sina would become. He grew up in an intellectual environment that saw knowledge as a single, interconnected whole, that believed the same human mind, rigorously trained and honestly applied, could and should move across all of it, that the physician who did not understand philosophy was practicing at only half capacity, that the philosopher who ignored the evidence of the body was speculating in the dark. He absorbed this entirely. He would spend his life building on it. But the city of Bukhara, for all its brilliance, was also a city in a world of political instability. The Samanids who made it flourish were already, in the year of Ibn Sina's birth, feeling the pressure of forces that would eventually end their dynasty. The Turkic peoples to the north and east, particularly the Ghaznavids, were expanding. The comfortable world of Samanid Bukhara, the world that would give the young Ibn Sina his education and his first great opportunity, was running on borrowed time. He did not know this yet. He was a boy in a city of books, in a family that took his education seriously, in a civilization that was producing some of the finest minds the medieval world would ever see. The borrowed time was enough to make him. What he did with it is where the story truly begins. Chapter 2. The Child Who Had No Childhood. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs only to children who think too fast for the world around them. It is not the loneliness of being disliked. Ibn Sina was not disliked. By every account that survives from people who knew him, including his own autobiography, which is one of the earliest surviving autobiographies in the Islamic world and one of the most remarkable documents of medieval intellectual history. He was a boy that adults found genuinely fascinating. His tutors spoke about him with a mixture of pride and something closer to bewilderment. His father invested in his education with the seriousness of a man who understood he was dealing with something he had not encountered before. But there is a loneliness that comes from moving through material faster than anyone around you can follow, from finishing the lesson before the lesson has properly started, from looking up from the page and finding that the questions forming in your mind have no one nearby who can meet them. Ibn Sina knew this loneliness from very early. His autobiography, preserved in the biographical dictionary compiled by his student al-Juzjani, describes his childhood education with a directness that does not reach for sentiment but lands there anyway, simply through the weight of what it records. By the age of 10, he had memorized the Quran. This was not, in the culture of 10th century Bukhara, as unusual as it sounds to modern ears. Quranic memorization was the foundation of education across the Islamic world, and children who showed scholarly aptitude were expected to complete it young. What was unusual was everything that happened alongside it. While working through the Quran, Ibn Sina was simultaneously absorbing Arabic literature, the foundational texts of Islamic jurisprudence, and the basics of mathematics, not as a sequence of subjects completed one at a time, but as a simultaneous immersion that he seemed to manage the way most children manage a single subject on a good day. His father brought an Indian mathematician named Mahmud the Grocer to the house to teach the boy arithmetic and the methods of Indian calculation. Ibn Sina absorbed what the man had to teach with a speed that the mathematician found difficult to process, and began asking questions that moved beyond what his teacher could answer. This was not arrogance. It was simply the nature of what was happening. The student had reached the edge of the teacher's knowledge, and the edge came faster than either of them had expected. He was then sent to a scholar named Ismail al-Zahid to study Islamic jurisprudence and philosophy. Al-Zahid was a serious and learned man, and the young Ibn Sina learned genuinely from him. But here again the pattern repeated. The student moved through the material and arrived at the outer boundary of his teacher's knowledge before the teacher had fully adjusted to having him as a student. Ibn Sina describes this period in his autobiography, not with pride, but with a kind of puzzled honesty. He was not trying to outpace his teachers. He was simply moving at the speed that the material demanded of him, and that speed happened to be faster than anyone around him could sustain. By the age of 13 or 14, depending on which historical account you follow, he had essentially exhausted the formal educational resources available to him in Bukhara. The tutors his father could find had taught him what they knew. The curriculum designed for serious young scholars of the Samanid capital had been completed. He was at the point that gifted children in every century eventually reach, the point where the structure built to educate them runs out, and they have to build something new for themselves. What he did next tells you everything about who he was. He did not wait. He turned to the books directly, working through texts that scholars spent careers on, without a guide, simply using the previous texts as keys to unlock the next ones. He described in his autobiography working through Aristotle's Metaphysics 40 times. Forte. He had memorized it. He understood the arguments. And still it did not fully yield its meaning to him. He kept returning to it, not because he lacked intelligence, but because the Metaphysics is genuinely one of the most difficult texts in the philosophical tradition, and he understood that difficulty well enough to know he had not yet reached the bottom of it. Then, one afternoon, in a market stall somewhere in Bukhara, he found a small book. It was a commentary on Aristotle's Metaphysics by the philosopher Al-Farabi, a Baghdad thinker who had spent his life working to reconcile Greek philosophy with Islamic thought. Ibn Sina bought it for 3 dirhams. A small sum. He read it that same day, in whatever light was still available when he got home, and something opened. The passage he had been working through for months, the argument about existence and essence that sits at the heart of the metaphysics and that had resisted his understanding despite 40 readings, suddenly became clear. He describes this moment in his autobiography with an immediacy that makes it feel present. The way certain memories stay sharp, not because they are happy, but because they are true. He had been given a key he did not know he was missing. Everything that had been locked came open at once. He set the book down. He went to the mosque and prayed in gratitude. This detail is worth holding for a moment. Here is a boy who has memorized the Quran, who has moved through the most rigorous education his city can provide, who has read Aristotle's Metaphysics 40 times and understood it well enough to know he did not fully understand it. And when understanding finally comes, his first instinct is not to sit with the satisfaction or to move immediately to the next problem. His first instinct is gratitude. The religious dimension of his life was real, and it was complicated, and we will return to it. But at 13 or 14, it was genuine and uncomplicated. He was a Muslim boy in a Muslim city who had just experienced one of the great intellectual gifts of his life, and he thanked God for it. The childhood was ending, not because his age demanded it, but because the work demanded it. The boy who had no childhood was about to become the young man who had no youth, moving directly from one kind of intensity into another, without the pause that most lives require between stages. There was no pause available. The world was about to hand him something extraordinary, and he had to be ready. He was ready. He had been ready for years. Chapter 3. The Door That Opened Everything. In 997, when Ibn Sina was 16 or 17 years old, the Samanid Sultan Nu II fell seriously ill. The court physicians had been unable to help him. This was not, by the standards of 10th century medicine, a reflection of personal failure. The state of medical knowledge at that time even in the most sophisticated Islamic courts, was a mixture of genuine insight and inherited error, practical observation and theoretical framework that had not yet been subjected to the kind of systematic testing that would eventually separate what worked from what merely seemed to. The physicians of Nur, the Second's court, were learned men. They simply could not reach what was wrong with him. Someone at court, through channels that the historical record does not specify precisely, suggested that the young Ibn Sina might be worth consulting. He had already developed a local reputation as someone whose medical knowledge exceeded his years by a margin that was difficult to explain through ordinary study. He was brought to the Sultan's bedside. He examined the Sultan. He proposed a course of treatment. The Sultan recovered. This moment is one of the pivots of the story, and it is worth understanding exactly what it was and what it was not. It was not the moment Ibn Sina became a physician. He had been practicing medicine in some capacity since his mid-teens, treating patients in Bukhara and building the clinical experience that he always insisted was as essential as theoretical knowledge. The historian Lenn Goodman, in his careful study of Avicenna's life and thought, emphasizes that Ibn Sina understood from the beginning that medicine learned only from books was incomplete medicine. The body had to be encountered directly, in all its resistance to theory. What the Sultan's recovery was a door, and through that door came something that would shape everything Ibn Sina wrote and thought for the rest of his life. In gratitude for his recovery, Nur II offered Ibn Sina access to the royal library. The Samanid royal library in Bukhara was, by the accounts of the time, one of the great collections of the medieval world. It occupied multiple rooms. It contained manuscripts that had been gathered over generations, texts in Arabic and Persian and in translation from Greek and Sanskrit, and languages whose origins were no longer entirely clear. Books of philosophy, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, music theory, jurisprudence, poetry, history, works that existed in very few other places in the world. Ibn Sina later described, in his autobiography, working through the library's contents with the systematic devotion of someone who understood that this opportunity might not come again. According to his own account, by the time he left, he had worked through everything the library contained. Whether this claim captures the full picture, or reflects the way memory tends to sharpen and simplify extraordinary experiences. What is beyond question is that the library transformed him. The accumulated written knowledge of a civilization that had been collecting and translating for generations was, for however long he had access to it, available to him. He moved through it the way he moved through everything, completely. Then, in a moment whose timing feels almost deliberately cruel, the library burned. The exact circumstances are disputed in the historical record. Some accounts attribute the fire to accident, others suggest deliberate destruction connected to the political turmoil surrounding the Samanid dynasty's final years. What is not disputed is the outcome. The library was gone. His critics, and he would acquire many in the decades that followed, later suggested that he had set the fire himself, to destroy the sources of his knowledge and make his own work appear more original than it was. This accusation is recorded because it was made, but historians who have examined the evidence do not find it credible. It has the character of the kind of accusation that attaches itself to figures who have risen faster than their contemporaries can comfortably explain. He spent the next 2 years in Bukhara. treating patients, continuing to read whatever he could find, and beginning to write. His first works date to this period, though none of the very earliest survive in complete form. He was already thinking about the project that would occupy him for the rest of his life, which was not simply to accumulate knowledge, but to organize it, to find the structure underneath the accumulation, to ask what medicine and philosophy and mathematics and theology had in common at their foundations, and whether a single framework could hold all of it without forcing any one field to betray its own best insights. But Bukhara was changing. The Samanid dynasty that had made the city what it was, that had built the library and sponsored the scholars and created the conditions in which a boy from Afshana could walk through a door and find his life's work, was collapsing. The Ghaznavid Turks were pressing from the east. His father died. The anchor that had held him to Bukhara was gone. And in 999, the Samanid dynasty fell. Bukhara was no longer what it had been. The door that had opened to him in the royal library now closed. Not just for him, for everyone. He was 20 years old. He had already read more than most scholars would read in a lifetime. He had treated the Sultan of Bukhara and watched him recover. He had walked through a library that no longer existed, and now he had to figure out what to do in a world that had just changed completely around him, with nothing to rely on except everything he had already become. It was enough. It would have to be. Chapter 4. The Book of Healing and what it actually meant. There is a problem with the title. When modern readers encounter the name Kitab al-Shifa, which translates directly as the Book of Healing, they tend to assume they know what kind of book it is. A medical text, a collection of remedies, something written by a physician for physicians, organized around the practical business of treating the human body. It is none of those things. The Book of Healing is a philosophical encyclopedia, one of the largest and most ambitious works of systematic philosophy produced in the medieval world, by any scholar, in any language, anywhere. It covers logic, mathematics, the natural sciences, psychology, and metaphysics. It engages with Aristotle not as a commentator to summarize a text, but as a thinker who has absorbed another thinker so completely that he can argue with him from the inside, accepting some conclusions, modifying others, and in certain places building something genuinely new on foundations that Aristotle had laid but not fully developed. The title is not wrong. It is simply healing in a different sense than most readers expect. Ibn Sina was not writing about the body. He was writing about the mind. Set that aside for a moment and simply feel what that ambition means. A single human being, writing by candlelight in rooms he was sometimes not certain he would occupy the following morning, attempting to produce a complete and coherent account of everything human reason could establish about the nature of reality, logic, mathematics, physics, the soul, God, all of it, one framework, one lifetime. Now back to the argument. To understand why the Book of Healing mattered, you have to understand the problem Ibn Sina was trying to solve, and the problem was Aristotle. Aristotle had died in 322 BC, leaving behind a body of work so comprehensive that it functioned for the next 2,000 years as an almost complete account of what educated people believed about the natural world and the foundations of knowledge. His works on logic, on physics, on biology, on the soul, on metaphysics, on ethics, on politics, had been transmitted through the Greek world and into the Islamic world through the great translation movement of the 8th and 9th centuries. The Islamic scholars who received Aristotle were not passive recipients. They were active, critical readers who understood both the power of his system and its problems. One of the central problems was theological. Aristotle's philosophy, taken in its most straightforward form, implied things about the nature of God and the soul and the creation of the world that sat uncomfortably alongside what the Quran said about those same things. Aristotle's God was not the God of Abraham. His cosmos was eternal, without beginning, without creation in the sense that the Abrahamic traditions understood creation. His treatment of the soul was ambiguous in ways that made the doctrine of personal immortality difficult to derive from it. The scholars of the Islamic Golden Age understood this tension. Some resolved it by rejecting the parts of Aristotle that conflicted with revelation. Some tried to reinterpret the Quranic texts to make them more compatible with Aristotle, and some, the most ambitious, tried to build a philosophical framework that could hold both without forcing either to become something it was not. Al-Farabi, whose commentary had unlocked Aristotle's metaphysics for the young Ibn Sina in a Bukhara marketplace, had attempted this synthesis. He had made real progress, but his system had gaps, places where the reconciliation was more asserted than demonstrated, where the seams showed if you pressed them. Ibn Sina set out to do what Al-Farabi had not fully completed. The Book of Healing begins with logic, because for Ibn Sina, logic was not merely a tool for winning arguments. It was the foundation of all reliable knowledge. Without a rigorous account of how valid reasoning works, everything built on top of it is uncertain. From logic, he moved to mathematics, treating arithmetic, geometry, music theory, and astronomy as related disciplines unified by their use of number and proportion to establish truths that the senses alone cannot reach. Then the natural sciences, then psychology, and finally metaphysics. Each section built on the one before it. Each answer created the conditions for the next question. It was a cathedral of argument, constructed one stone at a time, in the order the architecture required. Imagine for a moment what it would have looked like from the outside. A man at a desk, or on horseback, or in a borrowed room in a city he might have to leave by morning, building this structure in the margins of a life that offered him very little margin. No university, no research grant, no institutional support of any kind, just the argument itself, and the conviction that the argument mattered enough to keep building it. The psychology section was where the Book of Healing began to move into territory that his successors found most provocative. Ibn Sina distinguished between different faculties of the soul with a precision that anticipated later developments in what we would now call cognitive science. He was interested not just in the rational soul, the part that reasons and reflects, but in the vegetative functions that govern growth and reproduction, the animal functions that govern sensation and movement, and the specifically human functions that allow abstraction, self-reflection, and the apprehension of universal truths. And here, between the lines of his account of the soul, something extraordinary was taking shape. He was building toward a question. If you strip away every sensation, every memory, every physical experience, every input from the body, what is left? Is there anything that persists? Is there a self underneath the accumulation of experience? Or is the self nothing more than the accumulation? He did not fully answer this in the Book of Healing. He was saving it. The answer, or rather the most precise form of the question, was coming in another text, in an image so simple and so strange that it has been discussed by philosophers for 1,000 years. The metaphysics section of the Book of Healing is the most technically demanding and the most theologically sensitive. Here, Ibn Sina developed what philosophers now call his distinction between essence and existence. For any contingent thing, anything that exists but might not have existed, the fact that it exists is separate from what it is. The essence of a horse, what it means to be a horse, is logically separable from the fact that any particular horse exists. But there must be something for which this is not true. There must be something whose existence is not contingent. Something that could not fail to exist. Something for which essence and existence are identical. Something whose nature is simply to be. That something, Ibn Sina Arget, is what we mean by God. Not the personal God of narrative, not the God who speaks to prophets and parts seas, but the necessary existent, the being that grounds all contingent existence by being the one thing that existence is not an accident of. This argument influenced thinkers far outside the Islamic world. Thomas Aquinas engaged with it seriously and built on it. The distinction between essence and existence that Ibn Sina established became one of the organizing questions of medieval scholastic philosophy in both the Islamic and Christian traditions. He was building a single coherent account of reality. From the rules of logic, through the structure of the physical world, through the nature of the soul, through the question of what must ultimately ground all existence. The Book of Healing asked what kind of universe we exist in, what kind of creatures we are, and what it means for something to exist at all. These are not small questions. He thought they were necessary ones. He was right. Chapter 5. The Canon of Medicine. In 1159, a scholar named Gerard arrived in the Spanish city of Toledo. He had heard, through the networks of European scholarship that connected monasteries and cathedral schools across the continent, that Toledo contained something extraordinary. The city had been under Muslim rule for nearly 4 centuries before its capture by the Christian king Alfonso VI in 1085. What the conquest had revealed, in the libraries and private collections of the city, was a body of knowledge in Arabic that the Latin world had not known existed. Gerard of Cremona spent the next 47 years in Toledo. He learned Arabic. He assembled collaborators. He translated. Over the course of his career, Gerard produced Latin versions of more than 80 major works. He translated Ptolemy's Almagest. He translated works by Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi. And he translated Avicenna's Canon of Medicine. The canon arrived in Latin at a moment when European medicine genuinely needed it. Think about what Europe had in the 1100s. It had practical knowledge, accumulated over generations by physicians who had learned from experience. It had access to some Greek medical texts. What it did not have was what Ibn Sina had provided in the canon, a theoretical framework systematic enough to organize clinical observation into a coherent account of how the body worked and why diseases behaved as they did. The canon filled this gap in a way that nothing else available in Latin could match. Within a generation of Gerard's translation, the canon was being used at Salerno. the oldest medical school in Europe. Within 2 generations, it was required reading at Montpellier. By the 1300s, it was a primary text at Bologna, at Paris. At Oxford, the historian Nancy Siraisi, whose work on Avicenna's influence on European medicine is among the most detailed scholarly accounts available, documents the canon's presence across European universities through examination records, required reading lists, and the personal libraries of physicians, across a period well documented through several centuries of university life. The canon was printed in Venice in 1473, among the earliest medical texts to appear in print, and it went through dozens of editions over the following generations. Publishers printed books that sold. The canon sold because physicians bought it, because medical schools required it, because the framework it provided was genuinely useful to people trying to understand and treat disease in a world that did not yet have the tools of modern medicine. Now consider what this means in human terms. Picture a young physician in Bologna in the 1300s, sitting by a winter fire with the canon open on his knees. He is learning not just what to prescribe, but how to think about the body, why diseases behave as they do, what connects the particular patient in front of him to the larger patterns that medicine is trying to understand. He does not know the name of the city where the book was written. He has never heard of Bukhara or Isfahan or Hamadan, but the voice organizing his thinking is Ibn Sina's, and it will remain Ibn Sina's for the entirety of his career. Now picture another physician in Paris, a century later, and another in Oxford, and another in Krakow, and another in Lisbon. Generation after generation, city after city, century after century, the same voice. What made the canon so useful was not simply that it contained good information, though it did. It was that it modelled a particular way of thinking. The organising principle throughout is rational and systematic in a way that reflected both Avicenna's philosophical training and his years of clinical practice. His approach to evaluating treatments was one of the most important contributions the canon made to medical history. In the first book, Ibn Sina laid out a set of rules for assessing whether a drug actually works. The rules required that the drug be tested in its pure form. They required that results be consistent across different patients and different conditions. They distinguished between the effect of the drug and the natural course of the disease, asking whether the patient improved because of the treatment or in spite of it. The historian Michael McVaugh, who has written carefully on this question, notes that Ibn Sina's framework was theoretical in ways that limited its practical application in his own time. But the logic of systematic evaluation, the insistence that observation alone is insufficient without a method for distinguishing genuine effects from coincidence, is present in the canon in a form that anticipates the direction medicine would eventually have to travel. His account of contagious disease was another area where the canon offered something clear and practical. Ibn Sina proposed that bodily secretion could contaminate soil and water and contribute to the spread of disease between people. He recommended quarantine for tuberculosis. He used specific criteria to distinguish tuberculosis from other conditions that produced similar symptoms. His chapters on mental illness were among the most humane produced in the medieval world. Ibn Sina insisted that psychological suffering deserved the same serious medical attention as physical disease, that the physician who dismissed a patient's inner pain as less real than their outer symptoms was failing in their fundamental duty. there is an account, examined by the historian Lenn Goodman in his work on Avicenna, of Ibn Sina using a careful diagnostic conversation to identify the source of a young man's unexplained physical decline. He questioned the patient while monitoring his pulse, and noticed that when certain names and places were mentioned, the pulse changed. He identified the cause as a form of severe emotional distress producing genuine physical deterioration. Whether or not every detail of this account is precisely accurate, it reflects a documented aspect of his medical approach. He took the relationship between emotional states and physical health seriously in ways that were original for his time. The canon was not perfect, and we will address its errors honestly in a later chapter. But its imperfections do not diminish what it achieved. It gave physicians a framework for thinking about disease, not just a list of remedies. It insisted that the physician who understood the theoretical foundations of their practice was a better physician than one who merely memorized treatments. Ibn Sina wrote it in the margins of a life that gave him very little peace. He wrote it while courts rose and fell around him, while his circumstances shifted from comfort to danger and back again. He understood that the questions the canon set aside were not less important. He was keeping them for the other work. The other work was asking what human beings actually were. Underneath everything the canon told you about how to keep them alive, that question was going to require a different kind of book entirely, and it was going to require a thought experiment so simple and so strange that philosophers are still arguing about it today. Chapter 6. The Philosopher Who Disturbed Everyone. There is a thought experiment that Ibn Sina wrote sometime in the early 11th century that has never stopped being discussed. Imagine a man created fully formed, suspended in empty air. He has no sensory experience of any kind. He cannot see, because there is nothing to see and no light to see it by. He cannot hear. He cannot feel his own body, because the air supports him without pressure, and he has no sensation of weight or surface. He has never seen his own hands. He has no memories, because he has just come into existence. He has no perceptions, because there is nothing to perceive. Does this man know that he exists? Ibn Sina's answer was yes. He does. Not because he can see himself, or touch himself, or remember himself, but because there is something it is like to be him. There is an awareness present that is not derived from any sensory input, that cannot be reduced to any physical process. That simply is. The floating man knows he exists, because existence is the one thing that cannot be taken away, even when everything else is removed. Ibn Sina called this the flying man argument. Sit with that image for a moment. A man suspended in perfect darkness, without a body he can feel, without a world he can touch, and yet knowing, with absolute certainty, that he is there. That something is present. That awareness itself is a kind of existence that no amount of sensory deprivation can erase. It anticipates René Descartes by more than 600 years. When Descartes sat by his fire in 1641 and wrote, "I think, therefore I am," he was arriving, through a different path, at a conclusion that Ibn Sina had already reached. The self cannot be doubted even when everything else can be. The awareness of one's own existence is the one certainty that survives total skepticism. Whether Descartes encountered Ibn Sina's argument directly is a question historians of philosophy have examined carefully and not fully resolved. The Canon of Medicine was available in Latin throughout the period of Descartes' education. The philosophical works were less widely circulated, but not entirely absent. What is certain is that the argument was Ibn Sina's first, and that it represents a genuinely original philosophical contribution, not a restatement of anything Aristotle had clearly established. But the flying man argument was not simply an anticipation of Descartes. It was doing something more specifically Ibn Sinan in its purpose. He was making a point about the nature of the soul. If the self is present even when all sensory and bodily experience is removed, then the self is not identical with the body. The soul, the aware presence that the floating man finds when he looks inward, is something that the body does not fully account for. It has a reality that is not reducible to the physical. This was consequential in his own context, in ways that go beyond the purely philosophical. Ibn Sina was writing within an Islamic theological tradition that placed enormous importance on the afterlife, on the survival of the soul after death, and on the individual's accountability before God for the choices made in life. He was providing a philosophical argument for the soul's independence from the body that was compatible with, though not identical to, the theological commitments of his tradition. He was not simply translating theology into philosophy. He was arguing that philosophy, pursued rigorously and honestly, arrived at conclusions that supported some theological commitments, but that the alignment had to be demonstrated philosophically, not asserted by appeal to Scripture. This position made him enemies on multiple fronts simultaneously, which is usually the sign of a thinker who has found a genuinely difficult middle ground rather than a comfortably partisan one. From the direction of orthodox Islamic theology, the most powerful challenge came from Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, one of the most important Islamic thinkers of the medieval period. Al-Ghazali was not an enemy of philosophy in the simple sense. He had studied the philosophical tradition, including Ibn Sina's work, with the seriousness of a man who wanted to understand what he was criticizing before he criticized it. His book, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, written in the late 11th century, roughly 40 years after Ibn Sina's death, was a systematic attack on specific positions that Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi had held. Al-Ghazali's 3 central charges were serious. He argued that Ibn Sina's doctrine of the eternity of the world was incompatible with the Islamic doctrine of creation. He argued that Ibn Sina's account of God's knowledge was incompatible with the Islamic understanding of divine providence, and he argued that Ibn Sina's account of the resurrection was insufficiently physical, implying the soul's survival, but not the bodily resurrection that Islamic theology required. These were not trivial objections. Al-Ghazali made them with genuine philosophical force. The debate they opened in the Islamic world shaped Islamic intellectual history for centuries. And now, the historical irony: while Al-Ghazali was attacking him in the Islamic world, Christian Europe was receiving him as an authority. Thomas Aquinas, working in 13th century Paris, engaged with Ibn Sina's distinction between essence and existence as one of the most important philosophical contributions he had inherited. He built on Ibn Sina's account of the soul in ways that shaped the theological anthropology of Catholic Christianity. He used Ibn Sina's arguments about the necessary existent in his own proofs for the existence of God. Scholars have noted that Aquinas referenced Avicenna frequently throughout his major works, engaging with him as a serious philosophical predecessor rather than a foreign curiosity. Roger Bacon, writing in 13th century Oxford, described Ibn Sina as the most important philosopher after Aristotle. Dante Alighieri placed him in limbo in the Divine Comedy, alongside Homer and Aristotle and Plato and Socrates. Limbo, in Dante's geography, was not a place of punishment. It was the highest honour Dante could give to someone outside his faith, and he gave it to Ibn Sina, a Persian Muslim philosopher who had spent his life running between courts in Central Asia and Persia, who had never travelled west of Persia, whose native language was Persian, though he wrote his major works in Arabic, was becoming one of the foundational authorities of European scholastic philosophy. The man who disturbed everyone in his own world was, in the world he never visited, becoming a pillar. He disturbed everyone because he refused to stay on one side. He was a Muslim who read Aristotle more carefully than most Christians of his time. He was a rationalist who prayed in gratitude when philosophical understanding came. He was a physician who took seriously the reality of the soul. He was a philosopher who insisted that clinical observation mattered. He lived in the tensions because the tensions were real, and he thought that pretending they were not was a form of intellectual dishonesty he was not willing to practice. The cost of that refusal was high. It would get higher. Chapter 7. The Fugitive Years. In the year 1004, or thereabouts, Ibn Sina received a letter from Mahmud of Ghazni. Mahmud was the most powerful ruler in the Eastern Islamic world at that time, the Sultan of the Ghaznavid Empire that had swallowed the Samanid dynasty and extended its control across Khorasan, Afghanistan, and into the Indian subcontinent. He was a patron of scholars and poets in the way that powerful rulers of the period often were, using cultural prestige as one of the instruments of political authority. His court in Ghazni was full of talented men. The poet Firdausi, whose Shahnameh remains one of the great works of Persian literature, spent years there. Mahmud wanted Ibn Sina at his court. The invitation was not a request. Not exactly. When the most powerful military ruler in your part of the world expresses a desire for your presence, the distinction between invitation and summons becomes philosophical in the uncomfortable sense. Mahmud sent portraits of Ibn Sina to rulers across the region, a signal that he considered Ibn Sina his property by right of power, if not yet by physical possession. Ibn Sina declined. The reasons were practical. Mahmud's court was militaristic and orthodox in its religious culture, and Ibn Sina had already developed enough of a reputation as a philosopher whose conclusions sometimes sat uneasily with theological convention. The prospect of a court where orthodoxy was enforced by a ruler who used military force as his primary mode of expression was not appealing. There was also the simpler matter of intellectual freedom. The courts where Ibn Sina functioned best were courts where a scholar could think and write and argue without constant anxiety about whether this particular position would provoke the ruler's displeasure. Mahmud's court was not that kind of court. He left Bukhara and began moving. The next 20 years of Ibn Sina's life were the most physically unstable of his career. A period of movement between cities and courts, and stretches of genuine uncertainty that would have broken most people's capacity for sustained intellectual work. It did not break his. He moved first to Urgench, the capital of the Khwarezmian court, where the ruler was more sympathetic to scholars of his kind. He spent time there in relative comfort, working and writing. But the political situation continued to shift, and the pressure of Mahmud's empire continued to extend westward, making any court within his reach an uncertain refuge. He moved on, through Nasser, through Tus, through cities whose names are unfamiliar to most Western readers today, but which describe, according to the biographical tradition, a journey across the Iranian plateau and Central Asia made under real physical hardship and real political danger, in a period when the roads between cities were not safe and a scholar travelling without powerful protection was vulnerable. He was looking for a court that would give him two things simultaneously: enough security to work, and enough freedom to work without censorship. It was not an easy combination to find. He eventually reached the Caspian region and found something close to what he needed. He served at the court of the Buyid ruler Shams al-Dawla in Hamadan, eventually rising to the position of court physician and, for a period, to the administrative rank of vizier, roughly equivalent to a prime minister. The combination of physician and vizier was not as unusual in the medieval Islamic world as it might sound to modern ears. Medical knowledge was considered a mark of education and refinement, and scholars who possessed it were valued beyond their clinical usefulness. But the political responsibilities of the vizierate were real and consuming, and Ibn Sina found himself trying to run a government during the day and write philosophy at night. He describes this period in passages preserved by his student al-Juzjani with a mixture of exhaustion and determination that feels entirely human across the millennium that separates us. He chose to sleep less. He was imprisoned twice during these years. The first imprisonment followed the death of Shams al-Dawla. When a ruler died, the political arrangements he had sustained died with him, and the scholars and officials who had served him were suddenly in positions of uncertain loyalty to whoever came next. Ibn Sina was accused of corresponding with a rival ruler. He was arrested and held in a fortress called Fardajan for several months. He used the time to write, "This is not the detail of a man performing equanimity for his biography. It is the detail of a man who had organized his relationship with work so completely that disruption of his external circumstances did not disrupt his internal ones." He wrote 3 works during his imprisonment at Fardajan. One was a philosophical allegory. One was a treatise on cardiac drugs. One was a work on logic. He was in a fortress cell, under genuine political threat, uncertain about when or whether he would be released, and he was writing a treatise on cardiac drugs. The second imprisonment was briefer but more frightening, connected to a period of military unrest in Hamadan, when the authority of the court collapsed temporarily into something closer to chaos. Ibn Sina was hidden by a sympathetic judge and eventually escaped from the city disguised as a Sufi. The wandering mystics whose robes provided a kind of anonymity that was useful to a man who needed to move without being recognized. He walked out of Hamadan in disguise. He walked toward Isfahan. He was 40 years old, or close to it. He had been running for the better part of 2 decades. His student al-Juzjani was with him for parts of this period, and the accounts he preserved of his teacher during these years give us a portrait of a man who was physically tough in ways his intellectual reputation might not suggest. Ibn Sina walked long distances. He rode horses across difficult terrain in difficult seasons. He endured the physical discomforts of travel in an era when travel was genuinely hard, without dwelling on them in any of the texts that survive. What he returned to, again and again, was the interruption to his work, the time lost, the manuscripts left behind in cities he had to leave quickly, the arguments interrupted mid-thought by the need to move. The books mattered more than the comfort. The books mattered more than almost everything. There is something in this that connects to the tradition he was working within and also transcends it. The Islamic scholarly tradition valued knowledge as a religious obligation. Seeking knowledge was an act of devotion. But for Ibn Sina, the drive to write and think and understand went deeper than obligation. It went deeper than ambition. It was more like a compulsion that he had long since stopped questioning, the way you stop questioning whether you need to breathe. He arrived in Isfahan around 1024. He was 44 years old. He had been running for 20 years. He had written dozens of works in the margins of flight and imprisonment and political instability that would have given most scholars the reasonable excuse to write nothing at all. He had been asking, through all of it, the same questions he had started with in Bukhara. What is the soul? What is existence? What can reason establish about the nature of God? He had not stopped. He would not stop. Isfahan, finally, was going to give him something he had not had enough of: time. Chapter 8. Wine, Women, and the Accusations. Let us begin with what the sources actually say. Ibn Sina's student and closest companion, al-Juzjani, the man who travelled with him for years and who preserved the most detailed first-hand account of his life that survives, wrote that his teacher drank wine, not medicinally, in the way that wine appeared in the Canon of Medicine as a therapeutic substance with specific applications. Al-Juzjani wrote that Ibn Sina drank wine for pleasure, in the company of friends, in the evenings after his work was done. He also wrote that Ibn Sina had relationships with women, that he was a man of considerable personal magnetism, who attracted the attention of people around him, and who did not live the life of a celibate scholar. Al-Juzjani wrote these things not to condemn his teacher, but to describe him. He was producing a biographical account, and he included these details because they were true, and because he thought the truth of his teacher's life was more interesting and more complete than a sanitized portrait would be. He also noted, with what reads as genuine affection rather than excuse-making, that Ibn Sina justified his habits on medical grounds, arguing that generous living kept certain constitutions in better balance than strict abstinence. Whether Ibn Sina genuinely believed this, or whether he was rationalizing something he simply enjoyed, is a question that Al-Juzjani does not resolve. We should be honest that we cannot resolve it either. What we can say is that the justification was not entirely without foundation in the medical framework he inhabited. The Canon of Medicine treated wine as a substance with genuine therapeutic properties when used appropriately, and Ibn Sina's understanding of individual constitution included the idea that what was harmful to one person might be beneficial to another. Whether this framework applied to his own habits in the way he claimed is another matter entirely. The later biographical tradition, drawing on Al-Juzjani and on other sources of varying reliability, embellished these details considerably. By the time accounts of Avicenna's life were circulating in medieval Europe, the stories had grown. There were claims about the extravagance of his private life that went well beyond what the earliest sources support. There were suggestions that his habits of excess had shortened his life, a claim that became a standard moral of the story in traditions that wanted to use his biography as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pleasure. The historian Sohail Afnan, in his careful study of Avicenna's biography, distinguishes clearly between what the contemporaneous sources establish and what later traditions added. The contemporaneous sources, primarily Al-Juzjani, establish that Ibn Sina drank wine and had an active personal life. They do not establish the degree of excess that later accounts describe. The escalation followed a pattern familiar from the biographical traditions of other controversial figures, where elements that made the subject interesting were amplified over time until they became the dominant feature of the portrait. This matters for how we understand him, not because the truth is more flattering than the legend, but because the legend distorts something important. The Ibn Sina of the most embellished later accounts is a cautionary tale about genius undone by appetite. The Ibn Sina of the actual sources is more interesting and more human than that. He was a man who worked with extraordinary discipline and productivity across decades of genuine hardship, who also enjoyed wine and companionship, who did not organize his private life according to the most conservative interpretation of the religious tradition he belonged to, and who continued producing work of the highest intellectual quality until very close to his death. The contradiction, if it is one, is not unusual. Many of the most productive intellectual lives in history have been lived by people whose private habits did not conform to the ideals their work seemed to embody. There is another dimension to the Accusations that requires honest engagement. In the context of 11th century Islamic scholarship, the charge that Ibn Sina drank wine was not merely a personal criticism, it was a theological and legal one. Islamic law prohibits the consumption of alcohol, and a scholar of Ibn Sina's prominence, who was known to violate this prohibition, was vulnerable to attacks on his religious credibility that could extend to his philosophical work. Some of his critics used his personal habits as evidence that his philosophy was corrupted by insufficient submission to religious authority. This rhetorical move is as old as intellectual controversy. Ibn Sina's response, insofar as we can reconstruct it, was to maintain the distinction between the quality of an argument and the character of the person making it. A valid argument is valid regardless of who makes it. An error in an argument is an error regardless of how virtuous its author. His critics were not satisfied with this response. Some still are not. What we are left with, if we try to be honest with the sources and fair to their limitations, is this. Ibn Sina was a Muslim scholar who drank wine and did not live the life of strict personal piety that his religious tradition recommended. He was also one of the most productive and rigorous intellectual workers of the medieval world, a man who produced an output across difficult decades that scholars working in comfortable institutions today find difficult to account for. He held these things simultaneously, without the kind of conflict that expressed itself in his writing as guilt or self-recrimination. He seems to have regarded his own nature with the same clinical interest he brought to the nature of everything else. He was a particular kind of human constitution, operating in particular circumstances, managing that constitution according to his best understanding of what it required. We know what he wrote. We know what he built. We know that the accusations followed him through his life and beyond it, and that they have not, in the end, prevented the Canon of Medicine from being studied, or the Flying Man argument from being discussed, or the Book of Healing from being counted among the major works of medieval philosophy. He would probably have considered that the relevant evidence, he would probably have been right. Chapter 9. Isfahan, the Years of Clarity. He entered Isfahan in the autumn of 1023, or possibly 1024. The historical record is not precise about the exact date, and Ibn Sina himself, in the portions of his autobiography that survive, does not specify it. What is clear is that he arrived in a city that was, at that moment, one of the most sophisticated urban environments in the Islamic world, at a court that was ready to receive him. After 2 decades of movement and uncertainty that had tested everything he was, the city of Isfahan sits on the Zayandeh River in the central Iranian plateau, surrounded by a landscape that shifts between green and brown with the seasons, in a way that gives the city a particular quality of light that travellers across the centuries have consistently noticed. In the early 11th century, it was the capital of the Buyid ruler Ala al-Dawla, a man of genuine cultural ambition who had built his court into a centre of learning and literary production that attracted scholars from across the Islamic world. Ala al-Dawla received Ibn Sina with a warmth that was more than courtly courtesy. He understood what he was receiving. The man who arrived in Isfahan had already written the Book of Healing in large part, much of the Canon of Medicine, and dozens of other works across the most unpromising circumstances imaginable. What he had not had was a stable home, a court that would not be disrupted by political crisis in the middle of a chapter, a library he could rely on being there the following morning, the company of people serious enough to push back on his ideas in ways that helped them develop. Isfahan gave him all of these things. The years he spent there, roughly from 1023 to 1037, were the most productive and the most settled of his life. This is not simply a matter of output. Though the output was extraordinary, it is a matter of depth. The works he completed and the new works he began in Isfahan have a quality of sustained engagement that the earlier writings, for all their brilliance, sometimes lack. When you are writing on horseback, or in a fortress cell, or in a borrowed room in a city, you are about to flee. The work can be brilliant, but it cannot always be patient. Isfahan gave him patience. Picture the mornings. He rose early, as he always had, but in Isfahan, early rising was not connected to the practical need to work before circumstances changed. It was simply his preferred time, the morning hours before the city was fully awake, before the court began its demands, before the sounds of the day filled the air outside his window, were the hours when philosophical thinking came most easily to him. He protected them with the same care that other men protected their sleep. His student al-Juzjani served as his secretary and closest intellectual companion during these years, taking dictation, organizing manuscripts, asking the questions that helped Ibn Sina test whether an argument was as solid as it seemed from the inside. Al-Juzjani was not simply a recorder, he was a thoughtful scholar in his own right, and Ibn Sina valued the pushback he provided. They would work through a difficult passage together, Ibn Sina talking and al-Juzjani writing, and then al-Juzjani would raise an objection, and Ibn Sina would stop, and there would be a silence, and then the argument would either hold or it would be revised, and they would continue. This is what philosophy actually looks like from the inside, not the grand proclamation, the quiet back and forth, the willingness to stop and reconsider. The morning light coming through a window in Isfahan, while 2 men worked through an argument that had been started by Aristotle and was not yet finished. In the afternoons, the court made its claims. Ala al-Dawla held regular sessions that functioned as intellectual salons, gatherings where scholars from different fields presented work and argued with each other in the presence of the ruler. Ibn Sina was the most prominent figure in these sessions, but he was not unchallenged. Other scholars at the court had their own areas of expertise and their own intellectual pride. and the sessions were genuinely competitive in ways that Ibn Sina found stimulating rather than threatening. There is an account from this period, preserved in multiple sources, including the biographical dictionary of Ibn Abi Usaybiyah, of a debate at Ala al-Dawla's court on a question in Arabic linguistics. Ibn Sina was challenged by a specialist in Arabic grammar on a technical point, and his answer was not as precise as the specialist's knowledge of the field required. He was, after all, a native Persian speaker working in Arabic, and there were areas of Arabic linguistic refinement that fell outside his primary expertise. He accepted the criticism, and then he spent the next 3 years studying Arabic linguistics systematically, until he could address the question with the rigour it deserved. 3 years, on a point of Arabic grammar, while simultaneously completing the Book of Healing, maintaining his medical practice, and participating in regular court debates. This detail tells you something important about the quality of his attention. He was not a man who papered over the gaps in his knowledge. He was not satisfied with being approximately right or impressively confident. When he encountered a genuine limitation, his response was to address it, not to avoid the territory where the limitation was visible. The medical practice continued in Isfahan as it had everywhere. Ibn Sina treated patients from across the social spectrum, from members of the court to people who had heard that a physician of extraordinary skill was available in the city. His approach to clinical practice, as described by al-Juzjani, was consistent with what the canon described theoretically. He was a systematic diagnostician who took histories carefully, who examined patients with attention to details that other physicians dismissed, and who was honest with patients about what he knew and did not know. He also took students more formally than he had been able to during the fugitive years. Young scholars came to Isfahan specifically to study with him and would carry his methods and his questions into the next generation of Islamic philosophy and medicine. He was a demanding teacher in the sense that he did not accept loose thinking or imprecise language, but he was not unkind. Al-Juzjani's portrait of him as a teacher is of a man who expected rigour but who met confusion with patience, who understood that genuine understanding could not be rushed and that the teacher's job was to create the conditions in which it could arrive. He had one significant worry that the Isfahan years did not resolve. Mahmud of Ghazni died in 1030. He was succeeded by his son Masud, who continued the expansionist policy of his father. In 1030, Masud attacked Isfahan. The city was taken. Ala al-Dawla was defeated in battle, and the political arrangement that had given Ibn Sina his years of stability was disrupted in ways that felt, for a difficult period, like the fugitive years returning. His personal library was looted. He lost manuscripts that he had been working on for years. Some of what he lost he was able to reconstruct from memory. Some was simply gone. He was close to 60 years old. He had survived this before. Ala al-Dawla eventually recovered enough of his position to continue as a functioning ruler, and Ibn Sina remained in his service. But the disruption was a sign of what was coming. The world outside Isfahan was not going to leave it alone. In the final years of his life, he produced works that in their ambition went beyond anything he had written before. He was writing about the nature of existence, about the relationship between God and creation, about the soul's ultimate destiny, with the urgency of someone who understood that time was running out and that there were things he had not yet said clearly enough. He was also beginning to feel, in his body, what he had spent his career observing in others. The man who had written more carefully about human physical limitation than anyone else alive was encountering his own. He did not stop writing. There was more to say. There was always more to say. And the question that had driven him since the Royal Library of Bukhara was still not fully answered. What is it to exist? He was getting closer. He did not have much time. Chapter 10. The West receives him. In 1145, a young scholar named Hermann arrived in the Spanish city of Toledo. He had come from Carinthia, in what is now southern Austria. Having travelled south through the Alps and across the Pyrenees in pursuit of something that the libraries of northern Europe could not provide, he had heard that Toledo, only recently in Christian hands after centuries of Muslim rule, contained manuscripts in Arabic that represented a body of learning the Latin world had not fully encountered. He was right. Hermann of Carinthia was one of a generation of European scholars who descended on Toledo in the 12th century. Drawn by the same intelligence, they understood that something important was happening in those libraries. They were willing to learn Arabic and spend years in translation work that offered no immediate prestige and considerable intellectual difficulty. Because the material was worth it, they were not wrong. Gerard of Cremona, who arrived in Toledo around 1159 and would spend the next 47 years there, became the most prolific translator of the group, producing Latin versions of more than 80 major Arabic works. Among them was Avicenna's Canon of Medicine. But before the canon reached the universities of northern Europe, something else happened first. The philosophical works arrived, portions of the Book of Healing, particularly the sections on the soul and on metaphysics, were translated in Toledo by Dominicus Gundisalinus, working alongside a Jewish scholar named Abraham ibn Daud, who helped bridge the linguistic and conceptual distance between Arabic and Latin. These translations reached the cathedral schools of France and England in the mid-12th century and produced an immediate and complicated response. Complicated because the ideas were powerful and because they raised questions that the existing Latin philosophical tradition had not fully addressed. The distinction between essence and existence, the account of the soul's faculties, the argument for the necessary existent as the ground of all contingent being, these were not ideas that could be dismissed or easily absorbed. They demanded engagement, which is exactly what they received. Thomas Aquinas, working in Paris in the middle of the 13th century, engaged with Ibn Sina's philosophical contributions as carefully as he engaged with Aristotle directly. The Summa Theologica, one of the most influential theological works in the history of Christianity, carries Ibn Sina's fingerprints throughout. The distinction between essence and existence that Aquinas used to argue for the uniqueness of God, the account of the soul that shaped Catholic anthropology for centuries, the engagement with the necessary existent. Scholars have noted that Aquinas referenced Avicenna frequently throughout his major works, treating him as a serious philosophical predecessor rather than a foreign curiosity. He disagreed with Ibn Sina on significant points, but he disagreed the way serious philosophers disagree, by engaging with the argument, not by dismissing the person. Roger Bacon, writing in 13th century Oxford, described Ibn Sina as the most important philosopher after Aristotle. Dante Alighieri placed him in limbo in the Divine Comedy, alongside Homer and Aristotle and Plato and Socrates. The Canon of Medicine was being required reading in European universities while the philosophical works were being debated in European lecture halls. Now consider what is happening here. A man who spent his entire life in the Eastern Islamic world, who never travelled west of Persia, whose native language was Persian, who wrote his major works in Arabic for an Arabic-speaking audience, was becoming, in the universities of France and England and Italy, one of the foundational authorities of medieval learning. He did not know. He could not have imagined it. The world where his name was being invoked in lecture halls, where students were being examined on his texts, where his arguments were shaping the development of Christian theology, was as foreign to him as the moon. And yet, there he was. The medical reception followed a different timeline, but produced an equally remarkable result. Within a generation of Gerard's translation, the Canon was being used at Salerno. Within 2 generations, it was required reading at Montpellier. By the 1300s, it was a primary text at Bologna, at Paris. At Oxford, the historian Nancy Siraisi documents its presence across European universities through examination records, required reading lists, and the personal libraries of physicians, across a period well documented through several centuries of university life. The Canon was printed in Venice in 1473. Among the earliest medical texts to appear in print, and it went through dozens of editions over the following generations. What made it last was not that it was immune to criticism. It was revised and challenged and eventually superseded, as all frameworks in science eventually are. What made it last was the quality of the framework it provided, the insistence on systematic method, the demand that the physician understand the theoretical foundations of their practice, the habit of distinguishing between what observation establishes and what theory predicts. These habits of mind outlasted the specific conclusions. The man who had spent his life trying to reconcile reason and revelation within his own tradition was received most completely by the tradition he had not addressed. The thinker who disturbed everyone in his own world was, in the world he never visited, building something that would stand for centuries. This is one of the stranger ironies of intellectual history, and one of the most instructive. The ideas that matter most have a way of travelling further than their author could have imagined, into traditions and conversations and centuries that the author never lived to see. Ibn Sina's ideas travelled very far. They are still travelling. Chapter 11. The final campaign and the death he predicted. In the spring of 1037, Ala al-Dawla decided to lead a military campaign. The political situation in the central Iranian plateau had been shifting in ways that required the Buyid ruler to demonstrate his continued authority over territories that neighbouring powers were watching with increasing confidence. Ala al-Dawla assembled his forces and prepared to move. He wanted his court physician with him. Ibn Sina went. He was 56 or 57 years old. Depending on which account of his birth year you follow, he had been experiencing episodes of illness for the past several years. Episodes he had treated with the same systematic attention he brought to every patient, with the added complication that the physician treating him was the same person as the patient being treated. He was not a naive man about his own condition. He understood bodies too well, had observed too many patterns of decline over too many years to mistake what was happening in his own. Al-Juzjani records that he had been pushing himself too hard in the final years at Isfahan. The pattern of sleeping little, working through the night, compensating for lost time, with an intensity that the body could sustain in youth, but that extracted a higher price as the years accumulated, had continued past the point where his own medical knowledge should have told him to moderate it. Perhaps it did tell him. Perhaps he decided the work was more urgent than the warning. He developed colic on the campaign. The term in the medieval medical sources covers a range of abdominal conditions that cannot be diagnosed with confidence from the description alone. But the account al-Juzjani provides makes clear that it was serious and painful, and that it did not respond to the treatments Ibn Sina applied to himself in the way he had hoped. There were days when the condition seemed to be improving, when he was able to think clearly and work, when the possibility of recovery felt real enough to plan around. Al-Juzjani records that he continued to dictate during these periods, working on texts he had not finished, as if the possibility that he might not finish them was not something he was willing to concede to, while there were still hours in the day and a secretary willing to write. He had always worked this way. Then the rallies became shorter, and the difficult periods became longer, and the physician in him would have recognized the trajectory clearly, even if the man in him wanted to read it differently. He dictated a will. He freed his slaves. This detail, preserved by al-Juzjani and by several later biographical sources, is one of the most quietly moving in the entire account of his death. Ibn Sina, the man who had written in the Canon about the importance of treating all patients with equal care regardless of their social status, who had argued in his philosophical works for the dignity of the rational soul in every human being, freed every person in his household who had been held in the condition of slavery. He distributed his possessions to the poor. He arranged for the recitation of the Quran every 3 days until his burial. These were the acts of a Muslim preparing for death in accordance with the obligations his tradition placed on the dying. They were also the acts of a man who had spent his life thinking about justice and the soul, and the relationship between how we live and what we owe to others, translating that thinking into the specific decisions available to him in the last days of a life that was closing. His friends came. Al-Juzjani was there. Others who had known him at Isfahan and at earlier courts, who had argued with him and learned from him, and watched him work with the combination of admiration and bafflement that very high intelligence tends to produce in those who observe it closely, came to the room where he was dying and sat with him in the way that people sit with someone they know they are losing and cannot stop losing. The account al-Juzjani left of these final days has the quality of something written from close observation and genuine grief. He does not dramatize. He does not reach for the consolations of grand narrative. He simply records what happened, and the simplicity of the record is its power. Ibn Sina was ill. He treated himself. He worked when he could. He stopped working when he could not. He died. The exact date of his death is recorded in the sources as the first Friday of Ramadan, in the year 428 of the Islamic calendar, which corresponds to June, in the year 1037. He was buried in Hamadan, the city where he had served as physician and vizier to Shams al-Dawla decades earlier, the city where he had first been imprisoned, the city where the political turbulence of the central Islamic world had first made clear to him how precarious a scholar's position could be. There is a tradition that circulated after his death, carrying the kind of symbolic truth that tends to attach itself to stories about great minds, which says that in his final days, having recognized that his treatments were not working and that recovery was not coming, Ibn Sina simply stopped. He stopped the medicines. He accepted what was happening. He said, "In the account, as it has come down to us, that the body making its demands was stronger than the physician trying to manage them, and that continuing to treat what could not be treated was a form of self-deception that a physician of his understanding was not willing to practice. Whether this account is precise in every detail we cannot be certain, but it is consistent with everything we know about how he approached knowledge. He was not a man who maintained comfortable fictions when the evidence contradicted them. He had built a career on insisting that the gap between what we wish were true and what is actually true must be confronted honestly. In medicine and in philosophy, and in the account we give of our own lives, if he faced his death with the same honesty, it would have been consistent. His student Al-Juzjani continued after his teacher's death to compile and protect the biographical account that remains our most reliable window into Ibn Sina's life. He understood what he had been in the presence of. The city of Hamadan built a tomb. It was rebuilt in the 20th century in a form that still stands. A monument visited by scholars and travellers from across the world who come to stand in the presence of the place where the man who wrote the book that shaped medical education for centuries was put into the ground at the age of 57 or 58. He left behind more than 250 works by the most conservative count. He left behind the Canon of Medicine, which would travel further and last longer than he could have imagined. He left behind the Book of Healing, which asked questions that European scholasticism would spend 2 centuries arguing about. He left behind the Flying Man, suspended in empty air, knowing only that he exists. A thought experiment that Descartes would arrive at independently 600 years later, and that philosophers are still discussing today. He left behind the question he had been asking since the Royal Library of Bukhara. What is it to exist? The borrowed time had run out. The work remained. Chapter 12. What he got wrong. There is a particular kind of intellectual honesty that the history of science demands, and that admiration consistently resists. When we tell the story of a great mind, the temptation is to follow the thread of what they got right, to trace the insights that proved durable, and the arguments that held up, and the predictions that the future confirmed. This is a natural instinct. It makes for a cleaner story, but it is not honest. And in the case of Ibn Sina, who spent his life insisting that intellectual honesty was the foundation of everything else, dishonesty in his memory would be a particular kind of betrayal. So let us talk about what he got wrong. The foundation of his medical system was the 4 humour theory inherited from ancient Greek medicine. This theory held that the human body's functioning was governed by the balance of 4 fundamental fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was the proper balance of these humours. Disease was their imbalance. Treatment was directed toward restoring balance. This framework was not entirely without observational basis. The ancient physicians who developed it were looking at real patients with real conditions and trying to build a systematic account of what they saw. Some of the practical recommendations the framework generated were genuinely useful, not because the humoral theory was correct, but because the observations underlying specific recommendations were sound, even when the theoretical account of why they worked was not. But the framework was wrong. Fundamentally, structurally wrong in ways that could not be patched by refinement. There are no 4 humours in the sense that ancient and medieval medicine understood them. The human body does not work by balancing these four fluids against each other. The diseases that Ibn Sina classified according to humoral imbalance are caused by mechanisms bacterial, viral, genetic, environmental, that have nothing to do with the balance of phlegm and bile. Ibn Sina inherited this framework and worked within it with extraordinary sophistication. He refined it, extended it, applied it with more systematic rigour than any previous physician had managed. But the rigour of the application could not correct the error at the foundation. A beautifully constructed argument, built on a false premise, remains a beautifully constructed argument, built on a false premise. The implications for his specific clinical recommendations were significant. Some of his treatments were ineffective. Some were harmful. The aggressive use of purging and bloodletting, practices that the canon endorsed in contexts where humoral theory predicted they would restore balance, caused genuine damage to patients who received them. When William Harvey demonstrated in 1628 that blood circulates through the body in a closed system driven by the heart as a pump, the foundational account of how blood functioned that underlay significant portions of the canon's practical recommendations was overturned at a stroke. His understanding of contagion was, by modern standards, incomplete in ways that had practical consequences. He recognized that certain diseases spread from person to person and recommended isolation in some cases. But his theoretical account of how this spreading occurred was not germ theory. He did not know about bacteria or viruses, because the conceptual and instrumental tools needed to discover them did not exist in his time. The mechanism he proposed was wrong in its specifics, even when the practical recommendation it generated happened to be correct. His astronomy was Ptolemaic, placing the Earth at the centre of the cosmos, with the sun and planets moving around it in complex systems of circles and epicycles. This was the received framework of his time, and it was wrong. Copernicus would not propose the heliocentric model until 1543, more than 5 centuries after Ibn Sina's death. He could not have known what Copernicus knew. But the astronomical sections of the Book of Healing are built on a model of the cosmos that does not describe the cosmos as it actually is. Now, why does any of this matter? Not to diminish him, not to use the knowledge of later centuries to make a man of the 11th century look foolish, which is one of the lazier moves in the history of ideas. Every scientific framework in the history of human inquiry has been a temporary structure, more or less well suited to the observations available at the time, carrying within it the seeds of its own eventual revision. The Newtonian physics that replaced Aristotelian physics was itself revised by Einstein. The germ theory that replaced humoral medicine is itself being complicated by our growing understanding of the microbiome and the immune system and the genetic dimensions of disease susceptibility. Every framework is provisional. Every framework contains errors that only become visible from the vantage point of the next framework. What made Ibn Sina's system both valuable and limited was the same thing. He built it with such systematic completeness, organized it so rigorously, made it so internally coherent, that it was both more useful than anything that preceded it and harder to revise than a less complete system would have been. The very qualities that made his system so powerful in its time made it slower to give way than a looser, more provisional system might have been. This is not a failure of character. It is a structural feature of the way human knowledge advances. None of this makes him less than what he was. What it makes him is human, a human being working at the absolute frontier of what could be known in his time. with tools that were the best available and not yet good enough, building something that was genuinely and durably useful in some respects, and genuinely and significantly wrong in others, doing it all with a rigour and a honesty and a productivity that have not lost their power to astonish, even when we know exactly which conclusions did not survive. He would have wanted the accounting done honestly. We owe him that. Chapter 13. The Long Shadow. 600 years is a span of time that is genuinely difficult to make felt. Consider it this way. If you count back 600 years from the moment you are listening to these words, you arrive somewhere in the 1400s. Before the printing press had fully transformed European intellectual life, before Columbus sailed west across the Atlantic, before Leonardo da Vinci had painted anything, before Copernicus proposed that the earth moved around the sun, before Shakespeare was born, before the Reformation split European Christianity, before the scientific revolution, before the Enlightenment, before the American Revolution, before the Industrial Revolution, before everything that the modern world considers foundational to its own self-understanding, across all of that time, across all of those transformations, the Canon of Medicine was being taught in European universities. Let that settle. The historian Nancy Siraisi's documentation of the Canon's presence in European medical education is detailed and specific. She traces it through university statutes, through required reading lists, through examination records, through the personal libraries of physicians whose inventories survive. This is not a rough estimate or a rhetorical flourish. It is a presence documented across several centuries of university life, often summarized as roughly 600 years. And the documentation is real. But the shadow extends beyond the canon. It extends beyond medicine entirely. Thomas Aquinas built significant portions of the most influential theological and philosophical system in medieval Christianity on arguments that Ibn Sina had developed. The distinction between essence and existence, the account of the soul's faculties, the engagement with the necessary existent, all of this carried Ibn Sina's fingerprints. Acknowledged by Aquinas in frequent explicit references, and present in the structure of the arguments, even where the citations do not appear. John Duns Scotus, working in late 13th and early 14th century Oxford and Paris, engaged deeply with Ibn Sina's metaphysics in ways that shaped the development of scholastic philosophy in directions that historians of medieval thought are still tracing. William of Ockham, whose nominalist philosophy challenged the realist tradition that Aquinas had built, was in some respects responding to problems that Ibn Sina's distinction between essence and existence had made central to the philosophical agenda. The debates of medieval European philosophy were shaped, more than most surveys of European intellectual history acknowledge, by the presence of a Persian Muslim philosopher who had died before any of the Europeans who debated his ideas were born. In the Islamic world, the shadow is longer but more complicated in its character. Ibn Sina's influence on Islamic philosophy continued through figures like Fakhr al-Din al-Razi in the 12th century, who engaged with his work extensively and critically, and through the mystical philosophical tradition of figures like Suhrawardi, who built on Ibn Sina's ideas about the soul and illumination in directions that moved toward a more explicitly mystical metaphysics. The tradition of Islamic philosophy that descends from Ibn Sina continued in Persia even after al-Ghazali's critique had complicated its standing in more orthodox circles, producing a rich intellectual culture that persisted through the medieval period and beyond. The The flying man argument has received increasing scholarly attention in recent decades. The philosopher Dag Nicolaus Hasse, in his detailed study of Avicenna's influence on medieval European philosophy, traces the argument's presence in texts from the 12th century onward and documents how European thinkers engaged with it in ways that shaped the development of theories of self-knowledge and personal identity that eventually led to Descartes and beyond. The question of whether Descartes knew Ibn Sina's argument directly remains open. What is not open is the argument's priority and its originality. Ibn Sina asked the question first. He gave it its clearest early formulation. Ibn Sina's name today marks hospitals and medical schools from Tehran to Tashkent, from Dushanbe to Dubai. The Avicenna Prize, awarded by UNESCO for ethics in science, carries his name as the symbol of the kind of rigorous and humane inquiry that science at its best is supposed to represent. Contemporary researchers in the history of medicine have given increasing attention to the canon's contributions to the methodology of clinical investigation. The historian Michael McVaugh's work on the canon's approach to drug testing has been influential in revising the standard account of where systematic clinical methodology began. The standard account tends to locate the origins of clinical trials in the 17th and 18th centuries. McVaugh and other historians of medieval medicine have argued that the logical framework for systematic evaluation of treatments was present in the canon centuries earlier, and that the history of clinical methodology needs to be written with more attention to its medieval antecedents. What made Ibn Sina's influence last so long and extend so far was not simply that he was right about a sufficient number of things. Though he was, it was that he modelled a way of engaging with difficult questions that remained useful even when specific conclusions were revised. The habit of asking for the theoretical foundation of a clinical claim, the insistence on distinguishing between what observation establishes and what theory predicts, the willingness to acknowledge uncertainty while still committing to the best available judgment, the conviction that medicine and philosophy and the investigation of the natural world were not separate enterprises requiring separate habits of mind, but were aspects of a single human project of trying to understand the world we inhabit and our place in it. These are not medieval habits. They are habits that the best scientific and philosophical work in any era recognizes as essential. He modelled them in the 11th century in Central Asia. In conditions of political instability and personal hardship that would have given most people excellent reasons not to model them at all. The shadow is long because what cast it was real. Chapter 14. The question he never stopped asking. It is past midnight wherever you are. The world outside has gone quiet, or nearly quiet, and you have been travelling with this voice through 10 centuries and several civilizations and the life of a man who died in a campaign tent in 1037, having never stopped asking the question that drove everything. He did. We should end where he ended, not with a summary of his achievements. Though they are real, and they are documented, and they deserve the honest accounting we have tried to give them throughout this journey, not with a list of his errors, though those are real too, and they deserve the same honesty, but with the question itself, the one he carried from the royal library of Bukhara through the Fugitive years and the Isfahan years, and the final campaign to the room where Al-Juzjani sat beside him and wrote down what his teacher said while there was still time to write it down. What is it to exist? This question sounds, when stated plainly, like the kind of thing that people say late at night when the conversation has moved past what words can easily carry. It sounds like philosophy in the sense that the word is sometimes used dismissively, meaning something abstract and impractical and disconnected from the world, where people get sick and need treating, and cities need governing, and armies need feeding. But Ibn Sina did not experience it that way. For him, the question was not separate from the work. It was the foundation of the work. The reason medicine mattered was that human beings existed, and their existence was fragile, and that fragility was connected to the deeper question of what they were and why they were here rather than not here. The reason philosophy mattered was that reason itself, the capacity to ask questions and follow arguments and arrive at conclusions that the evidence supported, was a feature of existence so strange and so remarkable that it demanded investigation. He had developed, over the course of his life, a set of answers, the necessary existent, the being whose existence requires no external explanation, because existence is its essence, the contingent things, all the things that exist but might not have, grounded in the necessary existent, the way that shadows are grounded in the light that casts them, the soul, present even in the floating man, stripped of all sensation, knowing itself through an awareness that cannot be reduced to any physical process. These were serious answers. They were the most rigorous answers available in the 11th century to questions that had been asked since philosophy began. But Ibn Sina knew, because he was honest enough to know, that the answers were provisional, that the question was deeper than any available framework could fully reach, that the flying man, suspended in empty air, knowing only that he exists, was pointing at something that the best philosophical vocabulary of the 11th century could gesture toward but not fully grasp. He kept asking anyway. That is the thing about him that matters most, and that is most easily lost in the accounting of his achievements and his errors. He kept asking. Through the fugitive years and the imprisonments and the political disruptions and the loss of manuscripts and the physical decline of his final years, the question was still there, still being turned over, still being given whatever portion of his remaining attention the circumstances allowed. There is a kind of courage in this that is different from the courage of the battlefield, which the medieval world understood and celebrated, and more like the courage of the long commitment, the decision to stay with a question that does not resolve, to refuse the consolation of a premature answer, to keep the inquiry open even when closing it would be more comfortable. The philosophical tradition he worked within had a concept for what this kind of courage was for. It was for truth. Not truth as possession, not truth as the reward that comes at the end of sufficient effort, but truth as the direction of travel, the orientation that keeps inquiry honest even when the destination is not in sight. He travelled in that direction for 57 years. He covered an extraordinary amount of ground. The question is still open. This is not a failure. It is the nature of the question. And Ibn Sina understood the nature of the question better than almost anyone who has asked it. Philosophy does not close questions the way mathematics closes proofs, or medicine closes cases. It keeps questions alive long enough for the next generation of thinkers to find new angles on them, new tools, new ways of seeing what the previous generation could not quite see. The flying man is still floating. The question of what he knows about himself, and why he knows it, and what that knowledge tells us about the relationship between mind and world, is still being debated by philosophers who have access to neuroscience and cognitive science and analytic philosophy of mind that Ibn Sina could not have imagined. And the debate in its deepest structure, is still recognizably the debate he started. He gave us that. Among everything else he gave us, the long presence of the canon, and the arguments that Aquinas built on, and the method that shaped clinical medicine, and the thought experiment that anticipated Descartes. He gave us this, a question so precisely formulated that it has remained generative across 1,000 years of inquiry without losing its edge. You are listening to this in the dark, or the near dark. The world outside is quieter than it was when you began. 10 centuries have passed in the time it takes to fall toward sleep. A boy memorized the Quran in a city that no longer exists in the form it had. A young man walked through a library and carried it out in his memory. A physician treated a sultan and was given a door to walk through. A philosopher suspended a man in empty air and asked what he knew. The question comes down to you across all of that distance, not as a burden, as an inheritance, the thing that serious inquiry leaves to the people who come after it, which is not the answers, which are always provisional, but the questions, which are not, what is it to exist? You are here, whatever here means, whatever the nature of the awareness that is present in you as these words settle into the quiet of your mind. You are here. The floating man knew it without being able to see himself, or touch himself, or remember himself. You know it too, in whatever way you know it, in whatever framework you bring to it, or decline to bring to it. You know that there is something it is like to be you. In this moment, in this darkness, Ibn Sina spent his life with that knowledge. He turned it into medicine and philosophy and logic and a question that has not been fully answered. He died in Hamadan on a Friday, in the month of Ramadan, in the year 428 of the Islamic calendar. He was 57 or 58 years old. His student, Al-Juzjani, was with him. He had freed his slaves and distributed his possessions and arranged for the recitation of the Quran. And then the awareness that had been asking what existence was for 57 years was gone, or was transformed, or was returned to whatever it had come from, before it arrived in a village called Afshana outside Bukhara in the year 980. He had written over 250 works. The canon was already being copied and distributed across the Islamic world. The Book of Healing was in libraries from Cordoba to Khorasan. The flying man was floating in the philosophical tradition, waiting for the next thinker serious enough to ask what he knew. The question is still open. Sleep well,